week, we get to do our last lesson on Jesus the servant. And in our passage today, Jesus does something miraculous. He shows 3 of his disciples his glory. Now, glory is one of those funny words that might not make a lot of sense to you, but this is how I think of it. Glory is when we get to see how wonderful and amazing God truly is. And Jesus didn't show that all the time to everyone, but sometimes he did miracles to show God's glory. And in our lesson today, he takes 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, up Mount Hermon. That's a funny name for a mountain. Sounds like my uncle. Mount Hermon. He takes them up Mount Hermon, and he takes them there to pray. But, you know, a lot of times when Jesus would take disciples to pray, do you know what they would do? They fell asleep. And while they were sleeping, something called the Transfiguration happened. Now, Transfiguration is just a big old Bible word that means a change in his figure. In fact, Jesus's appearance, his figure, totally changed. His face was glowing and his clothes became all white. And this is just one way that we know Jesus really is God. He really is. So this happened, and then the disciples awoke. And when they did, do you know who Jesus was talking to? He was talking to Moses and Elijah. Now, Moses and Elijah were 2 men from the Old Testament. Do you remember? Moses is the one who led God's people out of slavery in Egypt. Now, Moses had already died. How was Jesus talking to him? Because he's God, and it was a miracle. And then Elijah was one of the prophets who God sent to tell his people, take care of his people, and perform mighty miracles. And do you know, Elijah had already died. He had gone up in a chariot to heaven. And so these 2 men were suddenly talking with Jesus. Well, the disciples were floored. In fact, Peter said, should we pitch a tent for each of you? One for you, Jesus, one for Elijah, one for Moses. And while Peter was talking, suddenly a bright cloud covered everything. That was God. Do you remember other times when God spoke to his people through a cloud? Like in the Old Testament, when the cloud would fill the tabernacle or the tent where the people would go to meet with God. The cloud would fill the tent, and that's how they knew God was there. Well, this bright cloud covered everything, and suddenly God's voice spoke and said, "This is my son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." Wow. The disciples were terrified, so afraid when they heard the voice of God that they fell down on their faces. But do you know what Jesus told them? It's the same thing he tells a lot of people in the Bible who were overwhelmed and afraid. He said, "Do not be afraid." And when they looked up, Elijah and Moses were gone. They were gone. Now, the Transfiguration is in the Bible just to show us a few things. Number 1, Jesus is God, and he gave us this small picture of his glory so that we would know how powerful he is. Isn't that cool? And number 2, Jesus doesn't want us to be afraid. He wants us to realize that we can trust him. He is mighty. He is powerful. We can trust him. We don't have to be afraid. So I hope that as you study this passage today, you think it's as cool as I think it is. There are some really neat things we can learn from it. Now, one more cool thing you might learn in our passage is this. The disciples, the 3, Peter, James, and John, asked Jesus a question. They said, "Why do people say that Elijah has to come before the Messiah?" And Jesus said, Elijah has already come. Now, when Jesus answers this question, the disciples are talking about something they had commonly heard. This was kind of a Jewish tradition. The people knew, or they would say, the prophet Elijah must come before the Messiah. Well, the prophet Elijah had already come, but when Jesus answers this, do you know who he's talking about? He's talking about John the Baptist. John the Baptist had come just like Elijah to declare the voice of God, to make way for the coming Messiah. John had told everybody, Jesus is coming. And then Jesus came. So it was Jesus's way of saying, yes, everything that God said would happen has happened. It is true. And I'm the Messiah. I'm the one God sent to save you. Open your eyes, I'm here. And everything you're about to see happen to me, when I die on the cross, when I rise from the grave, all of these things will show you exactly who I am. Such a cool story. I hope you love it, and I'll see you soon.
One day, Jesus led 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up on a high mountain to pray. The disciples fell fast asleep. As Jesus prayed, his appearance suddenly changed. His face was shining like the sun, and his clothes were as white as the light. The disciples woke up and saw Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you want, I will set up 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While Peter was still speaking, a bright cloud suddenly covered them. A voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." The disciples heard this and fell face down. They were terrified. Jesus came up and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When the disciples looked up, they did not see Moses or Elijah anymore. They only saw Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus said to them, "Don't tell anyone what you saw until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." The disciples did not tell anyone, but they wondered what Jesus meant. They asked him, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come before the Messiah comes?" Jesus explained that Elijah had already come. That is, a prophet like Elijah had come. The people did not recognize him as a prophet, and they mistreated him. Jesus said, "In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples realized Jesus was talking about John the Baptist. Jesus showed his glory to Peter, James, and John. Jesus said he would die, rise from the dead, and return to heaven. One day, Jesus will come back to earth in his glory to make all things new.